it's Valerie Ling. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm your host for the Clergy Wellbeing Down Under podcast. I'm looking forward to interviewing an expert today to take you through my findings from my research where I asked 200 pastors down under how they were doing. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Buckle up and here we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our next episode of the podcast. I have with me Katharine Moore. She's a personal friend, but also someone I think can provide us with some valuable insights into some of the dynamics that I've picked up in my clergy wellbeing and leadership survey. So welcome to you, Katharine.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here.
Now, Katharine, you and I go to church together as well.
We do.
So you are very familiar with church and Christian community. And I'm so eager to hear you, someone who's out in the commercial environment, very much leading and working in your organization in this space, and how you view some of the things that might have I've picked up in the survey and what's happening in churches. But first, tell us a little bit about you and your role.
Yeah, great. So I started in safety about 15 years ago, and I think over time it's kind of morphed a little bit from pure safety into health and well-being. And now definitely with the changes in legislation and changes in focus on how we manage psychosocial risk in the workplace, that's really become a fundamental part of the role and really important for how we shape how business responds, and not just responds, but identifies and prevents these types of hazards in the workplace. So yeah, I'm very lucky. I currently work for a global organization. Within my remit, I've got about 900 employees that I'm directly responsible for. But then I also get to impact globally. So very lucky that Australia is actually leading the way here. So a lot of my counterparts look to what we're doing here in Australia, and I get to help influence that at a high level as well, which is really cool.
And your role has also been very interesting given the last few years. How have you seen that impact the leadership tiers in your business?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge for leadership. I think that a lot of people still have the back history of victimization. That still comes up now, right? And leaders are very concerned about if we go too far here, if we open up too many doors, we'll have people in a victim mentality and we won't be able to bring them back out of that. So it's really about trying to create a very constructive environment where we can sit down and say, what's really happening in the workplace? What are the real challenges? And how do we empower people to I guess, overcome those challenges? So it's not about saying work is too hard, we need to put more people in. It's about what are the challenges in your role and how do we redesign your role in a way that you're empowered and you can get done what needs to be done.
At our organization, which is not 900 employees, we started to create our workplace wellbeing survey. And I have to say, Katharine, that even when I got the first draft, as the leader of my business, I felt uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's a human reaction, that anything that's going to investigate how things really are, that there's a human reaction that goes with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an emotional topic too, right? And especially for leaders, and particularly if you own your business, right? You've tried to create this really amazing workplace where people feel safe, and we reflect back to psychological safety, right? Sometimes, people think, oh, if they're putting up red flags around psychosocial, it means I haven't got this great workplace. I don't have psychological safety. I'd actually challenge that and say that's not true. If they're able to speak up and say, I've got challenges, then that means you do have a psychologically safe workplace because they feel safe to speak up. So now it's about working in partnership with your workers to say, what can we do better? What can we do a little bit different? Or what can we improve?
Brilliant. Let's start with definitions, shall we?
Yeah.
So let's start. You were saying to me that there's a broader category, if you like, to what you do. So
Mm.
let's start with there. So it's psychosocial safety is one part of it. What is the
Yeah.
broader picture we're looking at?
You've got two components here. So within HR, traditional HR, we look at things like job design, role load, relationship conflict, bullying, harassment, things like that, even role clarity. These types of things are traditionally in HR, and they're generally dealt with in a reactive motion. So we set things up, we think they're good, and then people put their hand up and let us know that something's gone wrong, and we HR go and investigate. Anyone who's been in that kind of environment before, maybe they've been a bullying complaint, that type of thing, it's not a fun thing to go through, right? Because we don't assume the complainer is right. We just hear there's something and we go and investigate. And we investigate that person as much as we investigate the person that they're claiming bullied. So it can be quite an emotional um, challenge. It can be quite overwhelming for the person that's been involved. So then we go to the safety side of things. So we've got this risk management framework, which looks at going with a real unbiased view and looking at the workplace and identifying what hazards exist, what controls we currently have in place to prevent them, and then what we can do better. And prevention is the key in this aspect. So it's really about, can we eliminate this from ever happening again? Or can we control it in some way that it doesn't cause harm? So what we're doing now is we're merging these two worlds together. And we're saying HR have all the skills and experience in this world, but safety has the framework for how we can prevent it. So we're starting to work together in partnership, which is fun. I think in some businesses, they're going to find it quite successful. Others may find it more challenging as they bring these two worlds together and find a new way of looking at it.
So let's look at the world of church leadership.
Yeah.
When you think about it as a layperson in church, and then with your professional roles and responsibilities, what do you think safety, physical, emotional, psychological safety looks like for someone who's leading a church?
Yeah, it's really interesting. If we go back to the psychosocial, we kind of split it into two areas, right? Job demands. So under job demands, we might look at role overload, emotional demands, relationship conflicts, role ambiguity. Like these things are rife in a church, right? Like that's
Yeah.
find these things every day. And on the other side, we've got job resources. So how much job control, praise and recognition, supervisor support, co-worker support, change consultation. Maybe we're not so great at that in church, right? So you've got these clergy who are sitting here who want to lead their church and they've got all the challenges under the job demands, but maybe they're lacking some of the supports that they need in the job resources. And I think there's a few factors to that, like just observing as a layperson, I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what is the workload of a clergy person. It's really easy to say, oh, they just work on Sundays, right? They just do one sermon, maybe two sermons a week. That's it. So then there's that kind of, I guess, not direct challenging of it, but just sort of, oh, are they really under that much pressure? Is it really that hard? And there's a lack of transparency. A clergy person can't share what's going on, right? There's a lot of privacy, a lot of confidentiality with how they support their congregation. So there's a lot of lack of transparency, lack of ability to reach out and ask for support for themselves. But I think the biggest thing that I see is probably a lack of training. They go through some level of leadership training. Now, I know you've looked at that and you've looked at the different types of leadership and particularly servant leadership and where that leads. But do they get training in safety? Do they get training in psychosocial hazards? Do they understand the well-being and even self-care tips? I think that's probably an opportunity that we could bring in to support them.
So everything that you've said just there, we're going to need to put it on some kind of workplace safety poster because there are probably aspects of clergy well-being that have been researched almost in isolation, Katharine. So I'll give you an example, and I'm curious to see what you think. The jobs demands, jobs resources, role ambivalence very commonly has been studied within, and rightfully so, within the burnout space.
Mm.
Now, one of the things I was trying to investigate was to what extent does leadership burnout then lead to other kinds of what I call destructive leadership practices, or really in my framework, it was more it's inappropriate, it's forceful, and it's unhealthy, unhelpful leadership. How does that fit within a psychosocial or a safety model?
Yeah, well, that would be a red flag, really, for how they're going to impact the rest of their team. That type of behavior definitely is just going to increase the emotional demands and the role overload of the rest of their team. So, what we'd look at, and I've worked in other businesses that employ what they call constructive leadership, which really puts those sort of destructive behaviors aside and really aims for how you work in partnership and how you have that more open, healthy sort of leadership style. And that's what you're aiming for if you're going to prevent psychosocial.
Okay.
Having said that, I also think it's probably a red flag to say that person is suffering from some psychosocial risk.
Yeah, can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think we start to see symptoms from people. So when they're under distress, when they're under high levels of pressure, um, some of the symptoms come out can either be psychological or physical. So you may start to see things physical, might be stomach aches and headaches and things like that, muscle pain. But the psychological might start to be those early signs of depression or anxiety. So you might start to see a little bit of aggression, a little bit of anger, a little bit of snapping, because they're just not coping very well under the stresses that they've currently got.
Okay. Let's go through, in this time that we have, let's see what we can get out of your expertise. Job demands, job design.
Mm.
What are the key components in that, really?
Oh, this is a tough one, right? Because it's individual. So, a piece of work I'm doing at the moment is actually combining psychologists and a physical therapist to come in and assess each job. So, doing a job task analysis to understand what's the physical requirements of the task. That's pretty traditional. Most businesses are pretty good at doing that. But bringing in the psychological element as well to say what are the actual demands on it. So in this space, I'm definitely a layperson. I definitely bring in specialists to help me with this to identify, what's the level of concentration required? What's the level of interaction with other people? The level of problem solving? Those types of things have to be known. It has to be part of your job task analysis so that you can identify, well, what's the reasonable exposure to that in a shift? What kind of breaks do you want to bring into that? A bit like manual handling. We know that for really heavy manual handling, you want to have breaks in there. And that might not be a go have coffee break, it may be task rotation. And I think we need to start thinking the same well from those psychological pressures and saying, how do we rotate that task a little bit? I know you're very good at this. I've seen little hints of that, how you manage your diary and how you look at, what types of pressures you have in a particular activity and how you're going to break your day up. And I think that's what we need to start doing when we think about job design. It's not just the physical aspects.
I think you make some really interesting points. Do you think, and I don't know whether I know you've been doing some postgraduate studies, so maybe you have looked into this, but do you think the psychological and physical, like just looking at those two components, psychological and ergonomics and physical demands of roles have really shifted over the decades? Like there have been significant changes, do you think?
Absolutely. I think particularly as we start to bring robotics and AI and things in, we start to remove all the really base level jobs from a person's task and we leave them with the more complex tasks that have to be done by a human. And I think that just increases their exposure to those more complex activities that require more focus, more concentration, more problem solving. And it gives them less downtime where they're doing the really simple, mediocre kind of jobs.
So one of the common things I hear when we discuss the well-being of pastors
Mm.
is that, oh, but isn't that just part of the terrain? Pastors are meant to deal with pastoral issues. There will always be conflict in the church. And one of the things that I've observed when I talk to pastors is a lot of their role has got to do with complex budgets, complicated governance and compliance issues. The pastoral concerns, there's a lot of legislation around what you have to do, mandatory reporting, getting yourself, safe to be around children, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
If you look at that in terms of job demands, do you think that those are considered demands? Or are they
Yeah.
just like, oh, you know, that's pretty normal, ordinary. Everybody should be able to just sail through them.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think they are complex demands. They are. And I think it's become ordinary. So
Mm.
we've changed our perception on what we think is normal and what we think is hard. But it doesn't change the fact that it requires more brain power. It requires more concentration. You've got less opportunity for error as well. I think we're moving more and more into a world where we don't have capacity to accept error. We really expect everyone to be excellent at what they do and get it right first time. And I think that just keeps adding the pressure. I think the risk that we have is that we've normalized that and we've forgotten how hard it is. And so we have less tolerance when people do have either an error or they just say, you know what, it's tough. I need a break. I'm feeling fatigued by this.
Mm. And from your experience, even quantifying fatigue, I mean, that's one of the things that we've been looking at in our business, because we're well aware that the type of fatigue psychologists have is quite hard to quantify. How does one quantify fatigue, emotional fatigue, even?
I would love to know the answer to that. Look, I have seen things a bit like, when you go to hospital and they've got the pain scale. I've seen fatigue scales like that. It's hard again because I think everybody's perception is different. Everyone's experience is different and their tolerance level of fatigue is different. But we don't accept that as an answer. We really think that everybody's the same as us.
Mm.
And I think that's a challenge for leaders. For leaders, often they have a very high tolerance for being able to manage those complex tasks, for being able to manage fatigue. And they get to a position where they look at the rest of their team and they don't do it with any ill intent. But from their personal experience, they look at it and say, I don't understand why you're fatigued. I don't understand why you can't handle this level of task because it's less than I'm handling and I'm fine. So why aren't you? But I think we need to move to a point where it's okay to have, a fatigue scale where people say, for me personally, that's where I'm sitting, and this is what I need to get back up the chain a little bit.
Mm. So job design really needs to break down. You need to study what a person is doing during a day, during a week, and breaking it down into these various very specific components. And I've heard what you said. There's elements of complexity,
Mm.
uh, tolerance for error,
Yeah.
task rotation, task duration.
Yeah.
I don't know of any ministry context that has delved quite into that detail.
Yeah, I don't think they do. And I think my understanding of it, and obviously I haven't worked in it, but from what I observed, it's a very reactive role, right? You don't always get to plan out your week. You don't always get to plan out your day. It's about what turns up on your desk. And so, planning those opportunities for task rotation, planning those opportunities for breaks becomes more of a challenge.
So perhaps what I'm listening and reflecting on is that we as leaders can become a psychosocial and a safety risk to our team, not just for ourselves, when
Yeah,
those factors are there and we don't even know how to identify them.
absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I think the more pressure we're on as a leader and the more we're struggling, the more impact we're going to have on the people around us.
Yeah.
We have less ability to self-reflect and put controls in place to protect others.
I'd love to just pick up on what you said, self-reflect. Is that something that in your business you have a way of training or structuring or investigating in your leadership tier? Or is it assumed that everybody will know how to do that?
It's assumed. I did work for a business. I mentioned before about that constructive leadership, and that was really around 360 degrees and lots of coaching and lots of opportunities to self-reflect and to hear feedback around the impact that you're having on others. Because we often go out with intent and we view the world from our perspective of intent. But once we get that feedback of the impact we actually had, it helps us then to self-reflect and say, well, I went out with this intent, but this is how it landed. How do I change that? What do I need to do differently? Where I'm currently at, we don't have that in place at the moment, but it's definitely something I want to work towards.
Katharine, how does someone get feedback on the impact?
Through feedback surveys. So we were doing 360s, so that would be people above you, people next to you, and people below you. And it was a validated survey, so it was very well structured, standardized questions that would be done on a set frequency so that you could start to see the change that you would have.
360s have challenges, isn't it, about trust?
Definitely, yeah.
I mean, that's
It
one of
doesn't
the
work if you
challenges.
don't have trust.
Sorry?
It definitely doesn't work unless you've got the trust.
It's only one of the challenges in a business of my size, for example, because you can 100% identify who gave you the feedback because you've got such a small team.
Yeah.
Would you say that is an issue, I think?
It is, and it goes back to psychological safety. So remember that they are different, and it's really important that we see them as different. You may have psychosocial hazards that are not well controlled in your workplace, but if you have a psychologically safe workplace where everyone feels comfortable to speak up and talk about what the challenges are, it's going to really help your journey. It's going to help you get that true feedback and move forward.
Yeah, I'll just put it out there. It's something that I've been really trying to work on in our business because psychologists have very similar issues, the trust and confidentiality, because your peers can actually report you, if something, and it's the same with ministers. The conduct complaints can go through. But one of the things I'm working on is actually two things: fostering a relationship with a partner practice.
Mm.
They can get our feedback and we can get their feedback and do averages of analysis and be able to support one another that way so that our team feels safe to
Yeah,
say what they need to say. And it's an aligned partnership with another business that can help us. But for now, what we've actually done is we've actually hired and outsourced a third party to collect all of our surveys and our information so that 100% nobody is identifiable, when they give the feedback. Yeah.
yeah, that's how we did the constructive leadership. That was third party outsourced and all very well documented. So you knew who did the survey because you'd select your 10 people, but you didn't know who was saying what.
Yeah. Okay. Now, one thing that churches have different to businesses is that they're pretty much full of volunteers.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear the levels of conflict that have been reported by the survey in the survey. I mean, we always say our church is full of, we're not perfect people. Of course, there's going to be conflict, but these were the same questions that were asked of Australian school principals. So you're getting people endorsing physical, sexual, harassment, teasing, bullying, constant conflict and quarrels, gossip and slander. I mean, what is your view as a professional in this space when you hear about that level of conflict?
Look, I think it comes down to lack of transparency. I think that if it was more open, if it was more known, so I'll pick a different industry for a minute. If we look at retail, what we've done in the retail space is really vocalize and really start to share data around the level of conflict that customers are showing towards retail workers.
Mm.
And we're making it public and we're putting it out there to say, as a community, as a society, we don't accept this kind of behavior. It's not okay. And by doing that, it means that now other customers are feeling braver to confront inappropriate customer behavior and say, don't speak to that worker that way. And we're making it really public and really, really loud and say that this is not what we stand for. I think in the church, there's probably an apprehension about doing that because we need to create an image of Christians and what our values are and what our standards are. And we don't really want to publicly say behind the doors that things aren't going that well, that we're not necessarily living the values that we profess and that we value and that we believe in. But I think also the media takes quite a lot of joy in highlighting when Christians and churches don't follow the values that they stand by. And so I think there's probably some nervousness about being transparent about some of those behaviours. And the risk with that is that if bullies can bully behind closed doors, they'll keep doing it. You need to take those walls down, open those doors up, show the bullies the light so that others can stand up and say, we don't allow that kind of behaviour. And I think that's always going to be the challenge for the church is, making sure that we do stand for the right values and that we are known for that in the community and that, we're not getting taken advantage of by the media. But at the same time, we don't want to close off and hide what's happening behind closed doors.
One of the challenges I suspect in churches is that it does happen unseen. It's through the emails, it's through the Facebook and the SMS text. There are no formal channels to communicate, this sort of thing.
Mm.
And I find that really interesting in that I used to say, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. I think what people forget is that there's very often one pastor, or even let's say 3 to 5 pastors. When you have 3 to 5 pastors, your congregation is usually at the size of maybe 300-400 and upwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there are no two-way conversations in these sorts of setups. Like in my team, it's a two-way conversation. There's one of me and there's 20 on the team.
Mm.
But there's always two-way conversations, right? You know your role, I know my role. If we're kind of stepping on one another's toes, let's have a conversation and let's review that role.
Yeah.
Now, with pastors, you've got hundreds of people sending them emails, messages, discontent. And it's often not really a two-way conversation. It's, I have a problem with you. This is the problem. I expect that you will fix it. It's your job as the pastor of this church to fix it.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that goes straight back to role clarity, right? So not only does the minister need to know what the clarity of their role is, but the congregation needs to know what the clarity is as well. They need to know what is it they're responsible for and what are they not responsible for. Because I think you're right. I think people have their own perception, their own idea of what is under their control.
Do you think it's enough to go on a courtesy, care and love campaign? That's what Singapore did.
Really?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Oh, they had a little lion, I think. And, he was like the ambassador, I think, for courtesy. And so, the little cartoon will come on TV and remind you what the values were and what the behaviors are. And, have a little lion will then interact in the public. I mean, is that what we're looking at? Is it some kind of a campaign for church congregants?
I think we could do that for the whole community. I think the whole community has become quite vocal, quite brave in speaking out on social media and via emails. We have a different world now, right? Like how many of these people would say those things face to face with a person? I just don't think they would. I don't think they'd take the time and I don't think they'd be brave enough to do it. Whereas they've created this safe space at home at night, they can just jump on their keyboard and send out these messages without any real consequence. And I think we're creating a community of people who maybe are speaking before they think.
But let's say in your workplace, how do you cultivate a culture of managing conflict well, being respectful and knowing your limits when you're interacting with someone else? How does that happen?
Yeah, I think it is easier in the workplace. I think, you have stronger rules around role clarity, hierarchy, values, respectful behavior. But I think the key success I've always seen is having those conversations. So if I've got a problem with you, I don't go to your manager. I don't go to my manager. I go to you and I sit down and I have a conversation. I say, this is the impact that you're having on me. And then you can talk about your experience and what your intent was, and we can have an open conversation about how that went and what would be better next time. Obviously, if that doesn't work, there's escalation processes, but that's all really well formulated in a workplace as well. You've got your escalation process, you've got different support people to help coach you have those conversations or facilitate those conversations. I don't know that exists as well in the church. I think, from the congregation's perspective, they probably don't have as much clarity about the right ways to address their concerns.
Now, this was an interesting one because most pastors, and I think most congregation assume that the Bible, in terms of godly conduct, tells us how we are to behave as a church,
Mm.
tells us so what do you think is missing?
Um, Probably it's the interpretation of it, right? How people take the personal interpretation about how it impacts their behavior. I think people are very good at using the Bible to say how you should behave, but not so good at looking at the Bible and saying how I should behave.
Yeah. So let's say if you and I had the opportunity, one psychologist, one leadership, safety, health, and well-being practitioner, we had the chance and someone hired us and said, look, we're going to church plant and we want to set up some of the structures, so that the leadership well-being and transparency in the community, that's all been set up. What would be some things that you would immediately say, yeah, okay, here's what we need?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it would be great to sit down and align as a group and say, what are the key values we're going to take out of the Bible that we want to say, these are our non-negotiables. These are the things that we want to see every day. Because we accept that people are imperfect, right? We accept that people are sinful and that they're not going to live to the Bible standards every day. But what are the key ones that are just absolutely have to be there? And I think by sitting down and talking through that and agreeing on that, and then maybe even looking at it from, if we reflect back to the workplace, we have inductions, we have orientations where we talk to people about what is our culture, what are our values. Do we do that in the church? We welcome people and we welcome them as they are. But when do we sit down and say, this is what our church stands for, and this is what is really important to us and what we want to see living out in the people in our church?
So if you had to chunk that down, do you mean like values into behaviors?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
as specific as this is how we interact in the car park. This is how we interact in morning tea. Do you mean even really drilled down to that
yeah,
level?
potentially. Look, I think, if you look at things like car park and morning tea, I'd probably go to that level if there were issues there and we had to say this is what it should look like. But I think look at the key things that are problems. So how is it we welcome new people? How is it we deal with conflict? How is it we raise concerns about leadership in the church? Like those things that can be really challenging that maybe people don't know exactly the right process, the right way to raise those concerns.
Okay. And so we'd have a look and we'd align values. And I've often talked about a code of conduct within a
Yeah.
church, even. So in our business, I've actually recrafted job design to include what I say they're character statements.
Mm-hmm.
These are behaviors that come from our values that we all agree
Yeah.
are important and non-negotiable. And we have permission to call one another, including myself, out on it. Now, it's not been very like ingrained. It's a work in motion, but I've seen some changes in our team.
Yeah.
Instead of being afraid to say sorry, I did the wrong thing, it's just become automatic just to go, oh, I'm sorry, I missed the ball on that one, didn't I? Or it's like, yeah, that's one of the character virtues that we have.
Yeah. I love that. I think that's exactly what I was sort of leading towards, is exactly that kind of format. And I've seen it done very well. So in other business constructive leadership, a strong part of that is immediate feedback. So when you're in a conversation, if you've seen behaviors that are not aligned to what we've agreed to, then just calling that out in a really constructive way. It doesn't have to be aggressive. It doesn't have to be, you bad person, you're doing the wrong thing. It's just, hey, I kind of see you leaning towards this way.
This is the midpoint break for the podcast. If you want to put a pause and walk away and come back with it, make sure you do check out the description for all the various downloads that we have for you, including my full report, research, and reflections. You might also want to remember to like, share, and subscribe. So stop now or keep going.
Let's try and go this way instead. And I find that really effective.
All right, so let's go back to you and I. We get this amazing opportunity to take a whole year off to journey with a church planter or
Yeah.
planting scenario. So that's what we do. Is there anything else that you think? Or how about the job design aspect? What you want to see in that?
Yeah, I think the job design would be really interesting. Like I would love to actually bring someone in like a Valerie to actually do that job task analysis and really break it down, look at what is an actual component of that task and that job. Um, and then look at, is there ways, I don't know, I haven't worked in this field, but is there ways that we can start to build some strategies in to help the clergy, to help the leadership, to do task rotation, to take little micro breaks, or to take longer breaks at the right frequency so that they're avoiding that burnout stage. I think that would be really interesting to actually do it from that scientific level.
Yeah, we once had a really interesting assignment that was given to us. It was such a compassionate request. It was from a church who was in the process of hiring an individual that had certain capacity issues. Let's just put it that way. And at the time on staff, we had a mental health occupational therapist.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what they went and did. They went and investigate the ergonomics. They actually went to investigate the task chunking down and made specific recommendations. Some of them were really creative, actually.
Yeah.
But I think what that did was it gave a conversation for the team to understand that when this person is making an adjustment, it's not them being precious.
Yeah.
This has actually been assessed that, for their sustainability. But how do you then share that? Like, let's say in this church planting context, let's say you've now got also volunteers, people in the congregation, how do you think we build that connection, that transparency, that empathy? If you could come in and make that happen, what would that look like?
Yeah, that's something I've been working on recently. So as we, I guess, move more and more to a world where we really want to create a workplace that is inclusive of all people, different disabilities, different capacities, and workplace adjustments become more and more part of the way we work. We really need to break down those misconceptions and those previous ideas that the general population have. So I think a lot of that is through training. A lot of that is just raising awareness, talking through the stories, sharing stories of real lived experiences. Um, and it needs to happen before you have that individual in that role. So it has to be the general awareness, the general foundation for everyone that this is our culture, this is our values, we accept people as they are. And, we need to break down some of those systemic barriers that prevent people with different disabilities, whether they're physical, psychological, whether it's even not a disability of their own, maybe there's other reasons, other care requirements that they have that they need those adjustments, and just create that as the new normal that people accept and people understand the purpose behind it, and that it's not about an individual needing preferential treatment or something like that. It's just about prevention of those barriers. I think once you get that concept out there, people become much more open-minded and much more accommodating.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It's kind of looking at the whole body of Christ. There is spiritual maturity, there is growth and holiness and reaching out to people and introducing them to Jesus. And at the same time, we need to make sure that our internal structures are safe and strong, don't
Yeah,
we?
yeah,
As we're bringing people into disaster zones. I've had the very unfortunate, well, not unfortunate, I've been curious, but it has been very sad. I've just been watching all the docos out at the moment on the collapse of various mega churches.
mm,
It's almost like we need to get so many of our internal structures right.
yeah,
Why do we have this level of conflict happening? Why are so many ministers saying that they can't actually, they're exhausted, they're lonely, and they're worrying about their family? I mean, can you imagine that?
yeah,
When I go to work as a psychologist and I don't worry about my family safety because really the board and the police protect me.
yeah,
I am not obliged to give my any of my personal details. If
mm,
a client was stalking me or harassing me, I have the right to go to the police and
yeah,
actually lodge a report.
yeah,
We live, as psychologists, we live within the safety to know that, we have the option to decline work if it puts our family and our kids in, many people in ministry they don't have that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think even if they did, it's such a sacrificial role. It's such a put everything in kind of role. I think their own personal values really struggle with pulling back from a person, a person in need. I know I worked in a role several years ago that worked um, in community care and working particularly with homeless people, things like that, homeless children. And some of the staff and some of the volunteers, they put themselves at risk because they wanted to help these people and
Yeah.
they saw that the need was bigger than the risk to themselves and that the purpose, that the mission was bigger than themselves. And they really didn't have the capacity to put protection around themselves and put controls in place. They didn't really see the bigger picture that, if they're at risk today, they can't help people in the future either. And it was really important about trying to, I think, give them that bigger picture, give them that sort of ability to put themselves first and that it doesn't cause harm to the people that they're trying to help if you put yourself first and if you put some protective features in place in your role so that you can keep helping in the years ahead.
Oh, this comes out a lot for us in our practice with our clients. So there are not necessarily just the pastors, but ministry workers who didn't think twice about walking into a domestic violence situation.
Yeah.
Or walking into someone who was, under the influence of alcohol or drugs because they got called
Yeah.
to, when you look at that very quickly, like what are some ways that you even formulate what you're meant to do with that? How do you work with that?
It's so tough, right? Because yeah, it's so tough on so many values. It's about people who are sacrificial, and so it's really hard for them to put themselves first. It's also they see this mission so important, so critical, and so time pressured that they have to make a decision there. They have to do it there and then. I think the only way you can do it is really pulling people out of that position for a little bit, really bringing them back and helping them to see the big picture, the big purpose.
Yeah.
To help them have that mindset that they're able to step back when they need to.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's tough. Look, I haven't seen it done very well yet. When you've got someone who's really committed to that purpose, it's very, very tough.
I think what you said earlier is also being able to identify all of these as safety risks, because I mean, a psychologist wouldn't do that.
Mm.
If we got a call to step into a domestic violence situation, or we got a call to step into a drug and alcohol situation, we just wouldn't. We've been trained to identify what our role is, what the risks are, and what sort of 5 steps we need to take in order to make a quality decision before we jump in. So I wonder too whether it's part of the job design, I think, Katharine. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And it comes down to the controls we put in place, right? Once we've got that job design, once we've identified the risks, and this comes back to safety now, right? That risk framework. So have the job design, understand what the risks are, then start putting the controls in place for how you're going to prevent or mitigate that risk. And I think a lot of workplaces don't have that, especially in this kind of industry, whether it's the church or whether it's community care, things like that. I think there are businesses that really don't have that framework at the moment.
You've just given me an idea, if you and I were called to this wonderful opportunity to go and set up, work with a church planning situation, that's probably one of the formative conversations to have as a church community. We love our leadership team and our staff. Let's look at some of the risks and the controls together as a community.
Yeah.
And let's meet more regularly. What came up in the last quarter? We'd love to know. We'd love to actually work on how we can keep the leadership team well and safe. Other
Yes.
things that we need to adjust, because there'll be greater ownership, I suspect, when there's more awareness on a regular basis for just
Definitely.
things that have come up, and that the ministry team may just normalize as being that's just part of serving God, and isn't
Yeah.
that? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're going to finish with the questions that I've asked everybody.
Okay.
If there was a church, a pastor listening to our conversation right now, feeling burnt out, feeling like they failed even as a leader because, they're just not bearing under the weight of all of their ministry responsibilities. What's one thing you'd like them to walk away with and to actually either implement or think about?
Um, I think it'll come back to that framework. Keep it simple. It doesn't have to be professionally written, but start looking at what are the activities that you do, what are the risks that are associated with that, and what controls can you put in place to start to reduce it.
Okay. And let's say if a whole church is listening to us today, going, oh, we love our ministry team. We're so sad to hear about the state of affairs with pastors and clergy. What's one thing you'd like a church to really be thinking and working on as a community?
Um, I think um, it's hard. I'd like to say, this is what I'd like to say, is ask, don't assume. Don't assume that your leadership team is okay. Don't assume that the leadership role is really easy. Ask how it's going. I hesitate to say that though, because I don't know that the leadership team can answer that openly and honestly. But even if you don't ask, just assume that their role is big, their role is really tough, and think about how you can be a servant, how you can add value to the church, how you can add value to your leadership team. See if maybe there's a simple task that you can take off their hands and you can support them with.
Thank you. And finally, speaking more to policymakers now at the level of, HR and the
Yeah.
denomination who are looking after pastors,
Mm.
what's one thing you'd like them to walk away with in view of some of the things that we've talked about?
Yeah. Look, I really think they need to invest in this. I think that they need to go and talk to the experts, bring experts into the business if they don't already have that, to consult with them and to help them to start to put together some of these frameworks. I think training is essential, building that awareness both for the leadership team and for those around them, looking at how you support the especially new churches as they start to grow and start to build up, how they set themselves up for success. And then I think, implement, I really love the PDCA, plan, do, check, act. So don't just say we're going to do something and go and do it. Really plan it out, work in consultation, do it, but then check in, see what's working, see what's not working, and what you need to change and implement from there.
Mm. It's almost as I'm listening to you, I'm convicted myself because you and I go to the same church. So perhaps our ministry team is going to get a lot of love next few weeks. But I'm convicted myself that I wonder, even, within our context, if there's, three or four of us that just make that part of our hearts
Yeah,
to, every quarter check in with our leadership team,
yeah,
take them
I
out
like
for lunch, take them out for coffee, investigate, what is the level of safety and
it.
well-being at the moment. If we did that, I think that also fosters that trust and transparency, but it can be quite contagious because if, three of us know what the leadership team are dealing with, and then another three come into that,
Yeah,
as we're all circulating, we'll be able to actually provide a voice of compassion or perspective or reason uh,
exactly.
that can actually spread through.
Yeah, and I think that peer-to-peer sort of coaching, informal coaching, is really effective, and I think it's a really great way to start.
Yeah. Katharine, I knew that this would be such an amazing conversation, and it has been. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your wisdom and yes, your really clear thinking in this space. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. I love it. I love talking about this stuff. So, yay. Looking forward to what we can do together.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you liked what you heard and you think others should hear it too, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Catch you later.